So to beat the summer heat, I got out to my local air-conditioned cinema and lent an ear to A Quiet Place Part 2, written, directed by, and co-starring John Krasinski, and starring Emily Blunt and Cillian Murphy. And it was a good enough setup for A Quiet Place Part 3. We open on day 1, where Krasinski's Lee Abbott stops at a familiar pharmacy for groceries, noting on his way past the TV that some calamity seems to have recently struck Shanghai. A few blocks over, his son is taking part in a Pee Wee baseball game, which he joins friends and family to watch, until people's dogs get antsy and what appears to be a flaming asteroid streaks across the horizon. The citizens retreat to their cars, and not a second too soon, as hideous fleet-footed creatures begin to rampage through the town. As chaos spreads, Lee and his daughter take shelter in a pub where a poorly timed ringtone reveals their predators are particularly sharp of hearing. Back on the streets, an ill-fated cop's attempt to shoot the pursuer confirms bullets will be of little use either. Cut to day 474. It's immediately after the first film, and what remains of the Abbott clan have just discovered the creature's vulnerability to a special frequency of sonic feedback. The farm is trashed, though, and so they must pack what they can carry and set out in search of a new home. What they find instead is a desolate factory occupied by an all-too-familiar face, and a clue on the airwaves which points to a safe haven that could turn the tide against the keen-eared invaders, if they can survive the journey there. The Quiet Place series, as it can now safely be called, occupies a unique slot in modern pop culture, family-friendly horror. To be sure, the Saw and Purge franchises do numbers whenever a new entry drops, but I struggle to name another film property which delivers this degree of armrest-clutching fear while still keeping the language of a limb removal light enough for a PG-13. In particular, between their merciless hunger, impenetrable skin, and limber speed, the nameless creatures are honestly some of the scariest monsters I've seen in any media. It's a credit to Krasinski as both a director and screenwriter, or maybe just the MPA's wonky moral priorities, that something this disturbing can sell to kids and parents alike. The film deserves additional credit for foregrounding a hearing-impaired protagonist, and many other characters use sign language as both a necessary and a practical means of communication. A few sequences also play out in total silence as we enter the girl's auditory headspace. Aside from presumably saving big on sound mixing, there's an equally memorable terror to either all hell breaking loose or a single foe sneaking up behind our heroine, utterly oblivious to either. At its core, though, the series' strength is in small-scale, high-tension set pieces, even if that tension almost always boils down to a life-or-death game of Don't Wake Daddy. Sights that would be trivial in real life, like a narrow path of sand broken by a leaf pile, become heart-stopping obstacles. And every jump scare is that much more pronounced when the noise itself is a threat. Scenes of vacant streets are uncomfortably familiar post-COVID, too. The film's delay is evident from some on-screen dates, as its events occupy an alternate timeline much swifter than the filmmakers probably intended when it was slated for an early 2020 release. Still standing after a decade of ruining 80s slashers, Platinum Dunes returns to produce, and this time Michael Bay's involvement actually shows. The budget has doubled, and with it, the scale. Whereas A Quiet Place Part 1 stayed largely confined to a farm, its successor introduces expansive shots of nature in multiple distinct locations, from a cavernous abandoned steel mill to a commuter train full of corpses, which recalls the plane crash carnage from War of the Worlds. There's even an explosion and some pretty intense car chases. What's more, the film isn't shy about showing the monsters running and wrecking stuff in broad daylight anymore. No longer are they confined to the shadows and quick blurs. The less is more approach to monster movies pioneered by Jaws has endured for good reason, but the effects work here is solid, and Krasinski's camera never lingers on their more frenetic movements long enough for the digital scenes to show. Sometimes the creatures are in-your-face behemoths, and sometimes they're just a claw or a jaw creeping silently out of focus and into frame. The bombast is all relative, though. The cast remains small, and for every striking pan across dilapidated upstate New York, there's another 10-minute sequence set within a radius of as many feet. I was a bit cagier than usual with my plot summary up top, and that's because, well, there's not much plot to summarize. A little over an hour and a half long, not a lot happens, and what does is largely a transparent escalation of what came before. Aside from Roman numerals being a touch more distinguished, Part 2 subtly denotes direct continuation, not merely succession, and leaves the door that much further open for more to come. Going in, I heard then that a Part 3 was already confirmed, but even knowing that, I was not prepared for how abruptly this film ends. It's bigger by comparison, but the stakes along the way aren't that much higher. For good or ill, it's just a natural continuation of the events of its predecessor. Yet after that flashback intro, and a brief welcome back to theaters thank you, there's a Halpert-sized hole in this film that Cillian Murphy struggles to fill. Murphy's character Emmett is both one-note and enigmatic. When we first meet him, he's seemingly just a blue-collar townie, yet after society collapses, he's not only a masked recluse, but a painter? Maybe it's the actor's filmography, but I kept expecting him to be crooked. That didn't happen, so most development that he gets is shrugging that, yeah, he kinda is a weenie for never helping the Abbotts or trying to find a radio signal that he's been getting for months. Lee throws out a line in the prologue about Emmett's brother being stationed at a military base, but other than that, their relationship is brazenly backfilled post-Krasinski. It's understandable that this particular character wasn't planned when the first Quiet Place was pinned, but numerous other plot elements are well developed without exposition, such as a soundproof furnace that one can only occupy for so long before the oxygen expires. Indeed, many scenes necessarily take place without dialogue, as those who tell instead of show don't last long in this world. It's just a shame there's so few novel discoveries about or developments of this world and its inhabitants compared to their introduction. The first film revealed our protagonists, the rules of the titular place, the creatures, and how to defeat them. It also had iconic moments like Blunt trying to silently give birth in a bathtub and Krasinski committing suicide by Tarzan impression. This time around, well, we get roundabout confirmation that the creatures are aliens, arriving as they do with a meteor shower, and we learn they aren't fond of water, a bold pairing of twists after Signs. The trailers made it seem like man is the real monster would be the trope du jour for this installment, but human antagonists only occupy one scene, and a band of seaside madmen whom Emmett narrowly escapes by boat. In their stead, not only are the monsters less threatening for their weakness being known, but the story's conclusion is foregone from the second it's foreshadowed, down to an almost comically straightforward final moment. It's the same ending as before, but doubled this time. A Quiet Place attracted scores of YouTube nitpickers to riff on its plot holes, so I don't want to dwell on such minutia, but I was nevertheless floored by how much of the conflict in this film involved people getting separated or wandering where they shouldn't for no good reason, even for horror. Early on, the daughter breaks off from her departing family to grab maps from the basement where an only presumably dead monster still lies warm. Later, the whole second act is set in motion by her running off alone in the night to find somewhere to broadcast her earpiece. Her brother is recuperating from a bear trapped at the ankle at the time, sure, but why couldn't she just wait until morning and at least try to appeal to the buddy system? Emmett also repeatedly tries talking to a girl who he knows can't hear him, and then, despite insisting that humans who remain aren't to be trusted, fails to watch his six when consoling a creepy little girl in the middle of nowhere. Miss Abbott leaves her essentially one-legged son alone with a baby while the latter is low on oxygen, and then that son leaves that baby alone to wander a steel mill in search of... I honestly don't know what. Tension inherently comes from putting people in tricky situations, but you can almost hear the narrative gears grind as the script strains to justify getting people alone so one of them can trip over a can or fall short of breath. Alright, some even strayer thoughts. There's a lot of imagery and dropped concepts that are basically Chekhov's cat. Until part 3 comes out, they both are and aren't plot devices. These include the boy stumbling upon the decaying corpse of what is, I guess, Emmett's wife. At least 2 of the crazy dock people being afflicted with skin damage that looks like either hives or radiation burns. And anything about that island village which would justify introducing Jimon Hansu and then killing him 15 minutes later. There's a shot where Blunt places the baby in its crib, floating in the flooded basement, and this was a potent enough Moses parallel that I thought for sure he was going to send it down the river to be raised by strangers for some reason. Maybe the monsters are the 11th plague on a serious delay? Given that the creatures are known to be indiscriminately violent, it's baffling how many people use loud traps to warn of intruders. Though to be fair, I think only Spider-Man has really perfected the art of snagging and silencing people simultaneously. If the monsters are so sensitive to sound, you'd think they'd be blowing their own eardrums out constantly with all that shrieking. It's the one aspect of the creatures that seems to prioritize crowd-pleasing chills over in-universe credibility. I think it's now safe to say that Part 2 is the subtitle of choice for sequels to post-apocalyptic media, or at least ones with the girl with unique power will save the world trope. I don't think there's a lot of potential for Children of Men Part 2, though. With as much as creaking metal betrays people's locations, I would be picking up WD-40 by the armload alongside food and painkillers whenever I raid the Rite Aid. I am extremely unclear on how the monster got to the island at the end of the film. Did it know how to pilot a ship? Regardless, it's interesting that people would take shelter by the sea when the boats are constantly creaking and rocking on the waves. I guess the monsters know how to filter out natural sounds on a planet they're not from? A boat on the docks says Erie, and indeed it was. The Abbott's pharmacy of choice is across the street from a Radio Shack, which looks about as well maintained in their 2021 as it does in ours. Emily Blunt setting off a fire sprinkler system prevents the monsters from seeing her, so they're like a reverse Daredevil in that way. Also, this is not the first Emily Blunt film where you can hide from the bad guys by surrounding yourself with rain. Nor, for that matter, is this the first film where the aliens are defeated by blowing their heads up with a radio broadcast. Overall, I'd give this film a 6 out of 10. It looks great, it's well acted, and it's nail-biting as all get out, with some wonderfully nightmarish creature design for a mainstream picture. However, neither the new protagonists nor antagonists are coherently fleshed out. Whether to call that sensible or cynical, I can't say yet. After the smash hit that was the first film, some shot calling is earned, but I can only give so high a rating when I feel like I just walked out in the middle of the second act. When it's delivering claustrophobic horror, film simplicity is a strength, but when it's trying to world build or resolve its own mysteries and mishaps, it's a serious weakness. Or at least it feels like it's writing a check I wish I didn't have to wait at least another year to cash. It's not bad, it's just not totally finished. But speaking of being finished, I anticipate retiring my COVID closer segment with this video over next. Not only have I personally gotten a double dose of vaccination at last, but with the rest of the country rapidly following suit, theater chains have begun to relax on mask wearing and social distancing. All things considered, a day out at the movies feels like a much safer venture than it did this time last year, and the box office suggests I'm not the only one who thinks so. For my part, the local chain cinema is an intolerable slog to drive to, so I took a stroll across the neighborhood to the Grand Cinema in downtown Tacoma. As when I lived in Olympia, I'm proud to live in a city with a well-maintained independent theater, and I look forward to catching further films here and doing a bit of volunteering in the off time. And if I see something interesting, whether it's at a fancy big chain or humble local theater, I'll be sure to share my thoughts on it on here. In the meantime, thanks for watching and listening.